Hey, I'm Pep, and this is a Pep Talk. Now, admittedly, probably not in the normal scene you expect me to be in, board games in the background, that kind of thing. But somehow, I'm turning this into an idea for a Pep Talk. Because today's Pep Talk is about something new. Sometimes you sit down and you decide you want to play a board game that you've never played before. Maybe no one's ever played before. And so I want to talk about exactly how you can handle that situation. What the best strategies are for games you've never played before. Now, of course, different games have different types, so I'll try to be as general as possible, but we'll see how this goes. I kind of also want to use this as, let's say, an insight into the way that I normally film things, because I don't exactly go into everything with a plan. Today's plan was actually to do a 2-video review of Paladins of the West Kingdom. And when I woke up, it started snowing. It was actually snowing a lot more than it is now. But I thought, I kind of want to get out and take a walk. But I still had a video I needed to shoot. I got to get one done a day. And I thought, well, one of my favorite things about walking on the trail, in the winter especially, is after it snows, you can sometimes be the first person to take the footsteps in the snow, Unfortunately for today, that's not true. There's already some footsteps here. Someone beat me to it. But that doesn't take away the point. The point is sometimes you need to be the person who takes the first step into things. And so I decided I'd make that the video for today. It's something I've thought about in the past, so it's not all coming off the top of my head, but let's just jump right in. Sorry ahead of time if the video is a little shaky, out of focus, etc. Kind of a first time thing filming like this for me. Okay, so the first piece of advice I have when you're playing a new game for the first time is do not copy what other people do. And it's funny because sometimes that's the piece of advice I'll give, if you're playing a game maybe that other people have played before, you see what other people are doing, modify it, etc. But the problem is with a new game where no one's played it before, generally if you try to copy someone's strategy, it means that you're the second person to do it. And likely they're going to have a pretty distinct advantage because they were there first. They were doing it first. They also know exactly where they plan on going with it at the end, and you might not. And kind of importantly too, it's not really as much fun, Sometimes it can be enjoyable to do what someone else is doing, but wouldn't you rather try something different, Everyone is playing the game for the first time in this hypothetical situation, so it'd be cool if everybody tried something different. And that way, at the end, you can kind of see all the different strategies the game has. Speaking of strategies, you're probably wondering, what's the best strategy to just jump in with? Well, of course, all this always depends on the type of game. If it's a party game, the best strategy is probably just to have fun. But really, in my opinion, because something to add is that this type of gameplay, playing a game for the first time, that's actually my favorite way to play a game. I love the first experience of playing a game. I find it super challenging. It's like a puzzle you're trying to solve. And that's the thing, is that you don't usually go into a puzzle with an exact strategy. Well, actually, that's not fair. Sometimes people build the edges. But the point is, you want to approach it with an open mind. You need to learn things as you go along. So I don't think having a direct strategy from the start is the best idea. I think playing the game as it goes along, flowing, changing things up is the best way to do it. Often I see people do this thing that we're saying not to do, where you start the game with an exact strategy. I'm going to go for this type of thing. And then by the end of the game, they're like, this strategy sucked. Those things didn't come up enough. Well, it's the thing. If you decided you're going to use strategy A and none of the tiles or cards or whatever it is that would help strategy A come out, then it's just not going to work, right? So even if you do start off with a strategy, you really need to be willing to change your mind partway through. This is Surprisingly tiring on the arm. I think I need to work out. Switching arms, switching angles. So, oh, that's too much. Yeah. Next up, and also relative to the background that you have here, is that you kind of need to enjoy the game, and enjoy the beauty of the game if it's something that has a lot of good art. I mean, a lot of times when you play something, for the 50th time, you don't really think about the art as much. You just kind of think about the gameplay and how you're going to win, even how you're going to have fun. But the thing is, somebody, and often multiple people, put a lot of work into the art, the graphic design, whatever of the game. So, the first time you play it, I think it's a really good idea to appreciate it. And though often I'll complain when people really start to read the story bits of everything they do, it might be a good time for you to actually read all those story bits. It's your first time, the game's going to take a long time anyway. Why not just embrace it, read the little story bits, read all the little fluff, and have fun with it, Because if you never stop to enjoy the beauty, then what good is life anyway, right? Right? Now, I've talked about the next couple parts in videos before, but because of the type of video this is, where it has to cover a lot of ground, I'm going to bring them up anyway. First of all, actions are almost always important. Let's say you're playing a game where you get 4 actions a turn. If you have the opportunity to buy another action, it's probably worth it. Even in games where you have to feed that extra action because it's a worker, most times, even if you just took that worker and used him to get more food, then likely it's paying off. So at the end of the day, more actions usually means more effectiveness. Now, if you're playing some sort of a card game, usually actions are simply the cards in your hand. But either way, cards in hand are more options. In something like Magic, this is usually referred to as advantage. So, if you have 6 cards in hand that you have the option of playing at any time, compared to an opponent who has 2 cards in hand, you have the advantage. So think about that if you're playing a game that has the opportunity to draw and take advantage of a higher hand size, etc. And while we're talking about that, especially when you're playing a game for the first time, having the advantage of having extra options in general is a good idea. So early on, if you have the opportunity to grab multiple resources that you might be able to use later, it's a good idea to grab those, because then you're opening yourself up for different strategies that might come along down the road. Speaking of roads, I'm coming up to one now. And that brings up another, I want to say important topic, but not really, interesting topic. And that's sometimes, especially when playing a game for the first time, you come to what one might call a crossroads. You're given 2 options, and without any idea of exactly how the game will play out at the end, what kind of objectives will come out, what some of the later cost buildings will have, all those kind of things, you're suddenly put into a situation where you need to make one of 2 choices. Now, I could easily just say, well, if you have to make one of 2 choices, you decide what things you could probably build the easiest right now, what things maybe are easier to have access to, etc. But the thing is, there's often a way in games in order to figure out what actually is the best option in these situations. And that way is math. Let's say we're talking about the idea of thinking of objectives for the future. Now, most games take a similar strategy to Family Feud. That being, if you try to complete an objective early, let's say it would grant you an average of 3 points. Well, later on, when you get other objectives, the intent is for people who have missed grabbing objectives so far to be able to grab a future objective and catch up. So, likely, like in something like Family Feud, this is going to be worth approximately double the points. And usually, it won't cost double the resources, because the intent, again, is kind of for you to be able to catch up. Now, this isn't always going to be true, and sometimes it'll work out to closer to around the same point. But really, at the end of the day, the point is that you're not generally going to find objectives, buildings, etc. later in the game that will give you more than double the points of early game stuff. So something you could think about whenever you're playing these games and having to make these decisions is approximately how much things will be worth later, etc. The costs usually won't be much more than double later. So you can kind of picture that kind of thing in your head whenever making these choices. But generally, if it's early in the game and you have to make an A or B choice, if one of the choices gives you an ongoing effect, something that will give you an advantage each round, well, again, you can math it out. You can count it. You can say, okay, well, this says it will give me 1 wood per round for the rest of the game. The game has 6 more rounds. Now, the other one says it'll just give you 4 wood. Now, of course, the 4 wood is really tempting. It might even help you build some things. But mathematically, it makes more sense to take the one that gives you more things over time. And of course, that's an easy situation. It's trying to grant you the same resource. But sometimes it won't. Sometimes it'll give you one thing or another. Well, again, you can usually math these things out. Take a look at the board, see how hard it is to achieve certain things, and ironically, well, I guess not really ironically, but in most games, the resources are usually about the same, but in some, depending on how the game's going, what buildings people have built, etc., there can be more of one particular thing available, which technically weighs it a little less on that scale. So if everyone has easy access to wood, you probably don't necessarily need something that requires wood or gives wood. Okay, maybe this is just getting too obvious. So let's bounce on to the next type of suggestion, and that is to treat new games especially like puzzles. At the end of the game, the way that I try to do it is my goal is to finish with nothing other than points, whatever would normally have me win. Now, of course, I don't do this to the detriment of points, In some games, let's say a coin is worth 1/5 of a point. 5 coins is a point. Well, I'm not going to spend 10 coins on a card that will grant me 1 point just to get rid of coins. What I simply mean is that my goal is to have never gained those things if I didn't need them. Because if you, at some point in the game, spend an action to grant yourself 4 coins, and then at the end of the game, you have 4 coins left over, technically that means you wasted an action. You took an action that gave you nothing that you needed, because you didn't need those. And that's not always the case. There's exceptions, etc. But the point is, if you try to treat the game like a puzzle, you can kind of stop yourself from having wasted resources in the future. The thing is, of course, at the end of the day, you're not a wizard. You can't automatically predict every single card that's going to come up, every choice you're going to need to make. So that's why I suggest, let's say you have quests you need to complete, cards you need to buy, etc. In my opinion, you should probably be trying to focus on the things that you already have or have access to. That way, you're completing the puzzle that you know rather than the puzzle you don't know. If you have the opportunity to grab extra things, coins, resources, whatever, that's fine. But then treat it like a reversed puzzle now. If you have 3 purple cubes and 2 black cubes, well, when you're looking for quests, try to find the ones that have the things you already have. That way, again, you're not necessarily wasting anything. On the topic of wasting things, though, not every quest is created equally. And it's kind of what I was talking before about with the math. So, one of the easiest ways to do this is to look at the end game scoring. If at the end of the game, every resource is worth 1 point, every 3 coins is worth 1 point, That's about it. There might be other things, but let's just say that's what it is. Well, when you're completing a quest, let's say the quest were to grant you 5 points, but it costs you 3 resources and let's say 2 coins. Well, technically, in your mind, you think, well, this quest grants me 5 points, but it doesn't. It grants you 1 1/3 point or whatever, because you spent essentially points in order to complete quests. If it's not granting you much more than that, honestly, it might make more sense to just hold on to those resources. Because you might find other quests that are something like, it'll have a higher cost usually. Let's say 7 workers, but it gives you 14 points. Well, that one's worth 7 points. Maybe it'll also grant you extra workers, so you can kind of calculate those into the points. I'm basically talking about Lords of Waterdeep. Speaking of deep, this snow is getting thicker, and it is getting much more tiring in order to walk through. On the topic of tiring, especially when you're playing a game for the first time, if you don't like the game, it can get tiring. So, what do? I know in some people's case, they basically check out. They say, okay, well, I'm kind of done playing the game. I'll just do whatever I want. Maybe play on my phone. And when it comes to my turn, I'll just put a person somewhere, take an action, move on. Well, just because you don't enjoy a game right away, usually there's a reason why you don't. And so it might be a good idea to try to discover that reason. Change up your strategy, take a different approach. Even if you think you're losing and that's why suddenly you're not having fun anymore, well, a lot of people, not me personally, but a lot of people have kind of the mentality that when you're playing a game for the first time, it doesn't really count. You're not really trying to have someone win or lose. You're more trying to learn the game, get used to it, etc. So if you take that approach, rather than sitting there worrying about whether you're winning or losing or exactly how good the game is compared to another similar game, just play. Play the game. Do a weird strategy. Try to see how many buildings you can have destroyed by the end or whatever. Come up with something. Being a gaming pacifist for the most part, I don't suggest making your goal to ruin another player's game or wipe them off the map or anything like that. Although in hindsight, I think I literally used the words wipe you off the map at one point in the last big game I played. But they had it coming, I swear. But with the topic of, not really thinking about the score by the end of the game, maybe that's an approach to take. If you all at the table really believe that the first game doesn't matter and the points don't matter and all that kind of thing, well, maybe at the end of the game you just don't score points. Or, you talk about how scoring works and you make sure people understand how the scoring works and then don't even tell each other your scores. Maybe figure out your own score just for your own mental tally, or if you need to write it down on BGG or something like that. But just don't tell each other the scores. Because at that point, the person who finished the game with 30 points doesn't have to feel too overshadowed by the person who got over 100. They might have caught on during the game that they were gaining a lot of points, but usually at least one person has a score that surprises you when you play a game for the first time. It's either that person who scores extremely high or the person who scores really low, and everyone just kind of goes like, what were you doing during the game? I didn't feel like you were doing anything much different than we were. How did you end up so low, And you want to ask that question, but you kind of feel bad at the same time. But you know what? I think it's important that people don't feel bad on their first game about getting a low score or feel guilty about having a high score. I think it's good. First of all, the person who got a low score, not only for themselves learned what may not be a good strategy for the game, but it helps other players at the table see that, you don't gain a lot of points doing that particular thing. So it's a good learning experience. And same for the person who got a really high score. It shows some of the things that probably helped to get the score higher. Maybe showed people when they might need to target a player if they're gaining too much of a particular thing. Maybe you need to hate draft cards. Whatever it is, it gives people that extra little idea, extra little strategy behind how the game runs. But you don't want to take that too far. A lot of times I find when people finish a game, especially if someone did really well, they often get to the point where they start talking about where things were broken. That combo's too good. That's unstoppable. There's no way that can be beaten. This game has 6 factions. 2 of them are leagues above the rest, and that other one is the worst possible. Now, I mean, you don't want to argue with people a lot of times in this case because, I generally don't want to be argumentative. But when people say things like that, where it's just like so assured, this is bad, period. Well, that's not necessarily true. Rising Sun's a good example. When we played that the first couple times, if you haven't played Rising Sun, I'll try to explain a little bit. But one of the factions essentially has the ability to choose the action that you take no matter what. Normally, out of the 5 actions, you draw 3 tiles. Some of them might even have duplicates. You have to pick your action from that. This clan, I believe they're the Lotus clan, lets you pick your action, period. Now on top of that, when you pick the action, it gives an extra bonus to your ally as well. So, at that point, you're essentially giving 2 players a bonus, and you make yourself a very desirable ally, because you can kind of pick and choose what you want. And so at the end of the first, and I think second time we played that, someone at the table said, "Oh, that's way too overpowered. Like, that person just has choice of whatever they want." But overpowered is relative, and something like that gives you an advantage, but it doesn't give you a mathematical advantage. It gives you a situational advantage. Because at the end of the day, there's a chance you might have drawn the tile you wanted anyway. And when you take another action, it's not like you have to take an action you don't get a benefit from. You still gain some sort of benefit. So the other factions often have numerical bonuses. One of them can buy anything for 1 coin. This saves money in the long term. One of them gets free soldiers on the map. One of them gets to treat their coins as Ronin, which isn't necessarily a mathematical benefit, but it usually is. The point is, there's ways and situations that some things are beneficial and some aren't. And at the end of the day, if you feel like a faction is completely overpowered, well, if a player takes that faction, be a little more rough on them. Or don't play right into their strengths. If the whole purpose is that being their ally is too good, well, use that during the game. Try to insinuate that they should be swapping allies and trading allies. And if they don't, if 2 people try to ally the whole time, again, gang up on them to make sure that 2 players don't get the sole advantage of a particular thing. There's just so many ways around those kind of things. And at the end of the day, are there cards or buildings or factions in games that are broken and overpowered? Yes. But are you all mathematical geniuses and tacticians who can figure that out after playing a game for the first time? No. So, I'm not saying that you shouldn't complain about a game after the fact. I'm just saying maybe play it a few times before jumping to those kind of conclusions. And if you really think a faction is overpowered, try playing it yourself. Because I've seen plenty of situations like that where someone will say, "This was so good during the first game," then they'll play it, and then it'll go bad, and then they'll just be like, "Oh, I must have done something wrong." And that's the point. Just because someone did well doesn't mean the game is at blame. Sometimes people do well, and you should congratulate them for it. Be nice to people. And that's going to be my final piece of advice for playing a game for the first time as a group is be nice to people. You know, it's everyone's first game. Try not to bully anyone during the game or purposely steal their resources or gang up on anyone, you know. Again, it's not the end of the world if someone has more points than someone else at the end. It is the first game. If it gets really out of hand, there's a combo that you need to stop, feel free, but I just mean, try to be friendly for the first game, unless your entire group is just completely warmongering and that's the way they play a game, because that's fine too. But, you know, just think about it. Go a little easier on people when it's their first time, especially if you've played the game before. You know, jumping into that scenario, just be kind. Rewind. All right, this timing worked out perfectly because now I'm about to get to a nice little gazebo I can take a break at before I start heading back. And hey, that gives me one last idea for a final suggestion, and that's take a break. You know, after you finish a game for the first time, you might just want to jump right in and play again, and that's okay. But at the same time, it might be a good idea to take a break from that game. Let it all just kind of sink in, let everyone figure out what worked, what didn't work, what they enjoyed about it, etc. So that when people come back to it, they come back to it feeling refreshed, you know? Anyway, that's been my pep talk. Thanks for watching. If you have any other suggestions for ways you should play a first game, tips for people playing a game for the first time, leave them in the comments below. I'd love to read them. Otherwise, I'll have to keep walking. You know, maybe get it yourself sometime. Enjoy nature. Heck, if you can find a nice little area like this, bring a board game. You can play something during your walk. Now, that could be an idea for a future video. Well, hope you see me later. Bye!